So I want to take a minute and welcome our panelists today. Starting here, we've got Sarah Kirkle. She is the Director of Policy and Legislation at the Texas Water Conservation Association and oversees their policy and legislative efforts. CJ Tredway, who has been around the Capitol for over 3 decades and works as a government affairs consultant for the Texas Oil and Gas Association. And Trent Hightower, who's the Assistant General Counsel at the Texas Rural Water Association. I believe, Trent, this may be your first summit, so welcome if it is.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate you all joining me here today. So in our panel today, we are going to start off and just kind of have a few reflections on the big picture of what happened over the session, talk a bit about the fate of groundwater legislation, some government bills, and also talk a bit about looking forward. You know, they say every session, oh, that session was like no other. Well, this time it maybe actually was true. So, okay, wonderful. Well, I'm going to advance our slide here. So kind of looking at the big picture, Sarah, I was hoping you could maybe just talk a little bit about, you know, where did we think we were going to go? What happened?
Where did we end up?
Exactly.
Yeah, 2 very different places.
Yes.
You know, I think for those of you who are especially involved in conversations going into session, we talked a lot about it's going to be a limited bandwidth session. Because of COVID, it's just going to go at a much slower pace. And it did start out that way, right? But by about mid-session, it really had moved back into a normal pace. We thought we were going to be heading into a budget shortfall. That ended up not being the case. I guess people spent a lot of money online whenever they were locked up during COVID. And we knew that we were going to be focusing on redistricting, assuming we get the data, but we didn't from the U.S. Census Bureau, so that's going to be still coming up probably in the next special session. And we thought we'd talk a lot about COVID response. Instead, what we ended up doing is talking a lot about Winter Storm Uri. So that happened Valentine's Day weekend, as you all doubtless remember. And it turns out that the biggest water bill that ended up passing was actually the electric reform bill. Mm-hmm. Right? So that was the biggest thing that happened during the session. And it really just took up all of the room in the air, all of the air in the room. It was really hard to get focused on any other topic.
Yep. And Trent, turning to you, talking a little bit maybe more about that Senate Bill 3.
Right. So as Sarah mentioned, that was, you know, the electric reform bill, massive bill. Big chunks of it dealt with the electric grid, keep getting it winterized. But it did have some major water provisions. For instance, for utilities, it now requires utilities to provide service as soon as practicable in the midst of an emergency, an extreme weather event. It defines that now as a period during which the previous day's high didn't exceed 28 degrees, and it's not expected to go higher than that for the next 24 hours. Also requires utilities to work with customers on payment plans for bills coming due during that time. Something new that it also added is it requires all utilities to prepare and submit an emergency preparedness plan. That the EPP is definitely a phrase that I'm going to be hearing a lot about in the next few months. Basically, it's a plan showing exactly how you're going to respond to the next big event like this. You're required to, if you're a utility, you're required to submit this plan to TCEQ, as well as the Department of Emergency Management, your local electric provider and distributor, and TCEQ actually put out a plan in August, a template that utilities can use to submit that. There are some key upcoming deadlines coming up. November 1st is when you have to submit your critical infrastructure to your local electric provider and distributor. And that was really something that we saw a lot, was systems that had those communications already established with their electric provider really did better about keeping the water on because they were able to time when those shutdowns happened around the water utilities. And then March 1st, 2022 is when that EPP has to be submitted to TCEQ, and then they have until January 1st or July 1st to actually implement it. So those are kind of some of the big water provisions that were contained in that.
Right, thank you. And something I wanted to ask you about, kind of big picture-wise, CJ, was the bills filed, how many there were. We thought that there wasn't going to be much filed. Things didn't quite turn out like everything else as we expected.
Exactly. There were about 7,000 bills filed, more than 7,000, which was only 395 fewer than in 2019. And in the end, there were about 1,052 bills that passed. And that included bills that went to the Texas Senate Water Rule and Ag Affairs Committee and to the House Natural Resources Committee. And there were 140 bills that went to that Senate committee and 126 that went to the House committee.
And how did we see bills faring overall in the committees? Did a lot get through?
No.
We're going to get to that, right?
Right.
Absolutely. So I'll just mention quickly what TAG was up to during the legislative session. We have a legislative committee that will determine if a bill kind of falls in what we call our actionable category, something that we want to take a position on and engage in up at the legislature. This year, there were only 10 actionable groundwater bills that were voted on. And the legislative committee voted to support 7 3/4 of those bills, neutral on 3, and opposed, I would say, 1 1/4. And that's because, as you've all heard about, Senate Bill 152 was an omnibus bill. It had 4 distinct parts, and the legislative committee opted to take positions individually on those parts. We also did track some local bills for individual GCDs. We watched the general water bills. There were about 50 of them we kept our eye on, and there were 45 government bills. The government bills this last session had, I think, a bigger presence than before in light of COVID, open meetings, government transparency, all those kind of conversations, and we're going to get to that. So turning to groundwater bills, there is one bill of note that we can talk about that passed that is at least tangentially related to groundwater, Senate Bill 601, Senator Perry's produced water bill. CJ, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, Senate Bill 601 by Senator Perry created the Texas Produced Water Consortium to be administered by Texas Tech University. And the bill passed both chambers of the legislature and was signed by the governor with immediate effect on June 18th. The purpose of the consortium is to study the economic, environmental, and health considerations of beneficial uses of fluid oil and gas waste. And statute defines fluid oil and gas waste as waste containing salt or other mineralized substances, brine, hydraulic fracturing fluid, flowback water, produced water, or other fluid that arises out of or is incidental to the drilling for or production of oil or gas. So it includes a lot more than just produced water. The consortium will consist of an agency advisory council, a stakeholder advisory council, which will include groundwater owners, and a technical and economic steering committee, and private entities. And under the bill, there is to be by September 1st, 2022, which is really quickly, they are to create a technologically and economically feasible pilot project. And that is for the state to participate in. And the consortium is also required to produce a report by September 1st, 2022. I think that there is hope that there will be some additional legislation on this next session.
Yeah.
Follow-up legislation.
Was that something that Texoga supported? And
yes.
Much of the oil and gas industry was behind.
Yes. Yeah, we were very engaged in it.
In those conversations. And we're actually going to have a presentation tomorrow from somebody who's the co-director of, or will be the co-director of the Produced Water Consortium up at Texas Tech. Dr. Udemiri will be here, and Senator Perry, I'm sure, will also be mentioning that in his remarks tomorrow.
I'm sure he will be. So.
Absolutely. So moving on, Senate Bill 152. We heard a little bit about this yesterday from Chairman King. He talked a little bit about the fate, but we're going to talk about those 4 distinct parts and what they would have done, because I would anticipate that we're going to continue to see these pieces until at least some of them become law. So why don't we start with you, CJ? Could you talk a little bit about the notice provision that was in Senate Bill 152?
The notice provisions added a new chapter, section to Chapter 36 regarding a notice by groundwater districts that regulate the spacing of wells that are a certain distance from other wells. And it specified that these districts are to adopt rules requiring notice of application for a permit or permit amendment to drill a well or increase production capacity of an existing well, and that's to be provided to certain landowners that are specified in the bill.
And I think early on there were a lot of conversations at TWCA about this and didn't quite get over the finish line, but there continued to be some stakeholder discussions that ironed out some kinks. And at the end of the day, I think most folks got to where they felt like this is workable. We can live with that. But ultimately, because it was part of that omnibus bill, it didn't get across the finish line. So speaking of TWCA, Sarah, there were a couple parts of this bill that did come through the TWCA consensus process, both the petition for rulemaking piece and the unreasonable DFCs. I guess, shorthanded it. Do you want to speak to those for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a reminder for those of you who may not be familiar with TWCA's consensus process, we have a groundwater committee that has about 150 members, and we work during the interim to come together and think about proposals to bring to the legislature. And all 4 of these items actually came through our committee, but only the middle 2, the petition for rulemaking and the unreasonable DFC, were the 2 that came to consensus with the members of that committee, because it has very diverse perspectives on it. So the first one, the petition to change rules, that provision really is to allow anyone with a property interest in groundwater in the district to be able to petition a district to adopt new rules or change their rules. This process is based on the same process that is used to petition a state agency for rulemaking. And the idea here is really, even though some groundwater districts already had this in place, not all of them did. And so for those districts that didn't have that process in place, the idea was you can provide this clear process in lieu of having to sue a groundwater district, which is going to cost money for both the people that are suing the district and the district. And the second provision is really designed to address the uncertainty related to the management plan review by the Texas Water Development Board when a DFC has been petitioned or determined to be unreasonable. And what this bill would have done had it passed, and it was also filed independently as its own bill, is state very clearly that the previously adopted DFC is the one that should be included in a management plan that's submitted to the board, even if that DFC has been declared unreasonable or is under petition.
Thank you, Sarah. And just quickly, I would be curious to hear how you felt like, from TWCA's perspective, having that consensus process occur virtually. How did that go?
Well, I am new to my position, but I had observed some groundwater committee meetings in the past. I think that on Zoom, you find yourself, a lot of people turn off their cameras and they just listen instead of necessarily being very vocal and being very engaged in the process. Certainly, there are always a handful of folks who have stronger opinions that are going to sort of dominate and make sure that all the perspectives come out. But you do see much more engagement, I think, in person. Mm-hmm. And so we would love to get back there, or at least offer a hybrid option, because, again, folks are all over the state, and making sure that we have wide participation is also really important to our process.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So the final, last but not least piece of 152, the attorney's fees piece. Chairman King mentioned this yesterday as well, as being kind of the flashpoint that ultimately was the reason that 152 probably didn't pass. Trent, could you just take a minute to talk about that?
Yeah. So generally, the way it works now in law, if someone sues a GCD, and this is something, first off, it's something we've seen about the past 3 sessions, but if a landowner sues a GCD and loses, they're required, it's a mandatory award of attorney's fees for the GCD. There's no discretion on the part of the judge. This bill would have changed that to essentially changed a shall to a may, would have made it to where a judge had some discretion as to whether or not to award those fees. And so, as Leah mentioned, that was kind of a flashpoint and part of the reason this didn't make it through this session.
And there was another bill, moving on from 152, advance the slide here. Chairman King filed House Bill 3972, also had provisions related to attorney's fees. It did make it out of the House Natural Resources Committee, but not really much further than that. Could you take a minute, Trent, and share a little bit about that bill? Yeah,
so a big chunk of this bill was dealing with adding a bonding requirement when contested cases are brought by non-permit applicants. It required GCDs by rule to establish what that bond would be, and it capped it at $100,000. Again, this was voted favorably out of House Natural, but didn't receive a vote in the full House.
Is that a bill that Texas Rural Water Association had a position on, do you know?
We did not take a position on that one this session.
Wonderful. All right, so moving along, more bills that didn't pass. But I should say we talk about these because they'll probably be back. And the next two we're going to talk about actually were already repeat customers. We'd seen them filed a few times, and we'll probably see them filed a few more if they don't ultimately make it across the finish line. House Bill 2851 and House Bill 3619. CJ, would you cover those for us?
Yes, House Bill 3619 by Representative Retta Bowers of Garland passed the House but failed to receive a hearing in the Senate. The bill would have required districts to consider whether a proposed water use would unreasonably affect wells that are exempt from permitting requirements before granting or denying a permit or a permit amendment. And House Bill 2851 by Representative Eddie Lucio also passed the House but did not receive a hearing in the Senate. And the bill amended the water code by adding that modeled sustained groundwater pumping be considered prior to adopting DFCs. And the modeled sustained groundwater pumping was defined as the maximum amount of groundwater that the executive administrator of the Water Development Board determines may be produced in perpetuity from an aquifer on an annual basis using the best available science.
Yeah, and both of those bills, Sarah, actually originated
TWCA consensus
from
bills.
exactly from TWCA's consensus process, not this year.
Right.
They weren't, but previous sessions. So Sarah, a couple more that we wanted to mention that did get quite a bit of attention this session. Representative Wilson's House Bill 2095 and then Representative Larson's 2652. Could you just speak a little bit to those two bills?
Absolutely. So sort of like the bills that CJ mentioned, these are water data bills, and water data is a growing and evolving topic that seems to be getting more and more traction and more bills filed related to it in the legislature. I would say both of these really are stemming from a perceived gap in data related to surface and groundwater interaction, although the House Bill 2095, which would have authorized BEG to essentially develop comprehensive system of both surface and groundwater models, as well as the interaction between the two. So it was much broader than just surface and groundwater interaction. I think it's important when we're talking about these water data bills to think about, we know that these bills are going to resurface again. We have several members of TWCA who have concerns about how water data is used sometimes when you have conflicting models, or sometimes you have new models or new data, and that can be weaponized in permit hearings sometimes. TWCA's position is that science is important. We need to have data to inform water policy, and we support the Water Development Board and TCEQ as the agencies to direct those studies and to continue to develop that data so that we can have well-informed water policy. But again, as these bills continue to come forward and we try to address these gaps in water data, I think we have to be thoughtful in our approach. And I think it's important that while we continue to invest in additional data, that we are able to more clearly express the limitations of what that data can and can't tell us so that it's not misused and has unintended consequences in the future.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think House Bill 2095 did get a hearing in the Senate Water, Ag, and Rural Affairs Committee, and at least for that committee, it was the bill that got the most number of minutes of discussion, I think, this session. All right, well, that kind of takes care of the high points of groundwater bills this last session. I want to move on to some of those government bills. There were a handful of open meetings and transparency bills that were filed. Obviously, open meetings was something that after having the suspension from the governor in place to allow for virtual meetings during the pandemic, there was the idea that, oh, well, maybe we can make some of these changes permanent. So that was a conversation that happened, and was hoping that, Trent, you could just summarize kind of what did and didn't work out with respect to those bills. I've got Senate Bill 861 and House Bill 2103 and 859 up here on the screen if you want to start with those.
Yeah, so generally, like you said, there were a whole bunch of bills filed this session that would have kind of made permanent some aspects of what the governor did on a temporary basis due to the pandemic. Some of them were very permissive, some of them were much more nuanced. But in general, none of them passed. It was pretty much just a I think the general feeling at the legislature was these ideas kind of need more vetting. There needs to be more time to have those discussions and not really change the whole Open Meetings Act right now in the midst of the ongoing pandemic. But specifically, just kind of a couple of examples of these, SB 861, it would have broadly allowed entities subject to the Open Meetings Act to have increased access to telephone and video conference meetings without the need for declaring an emergency, as is currently the case in law. And then HB 2103 and SB 859, that would have clarified that meetings of groundwater conservation districts within groundwater management areas are subject to the provisions regarding video and telephone meetings currently in the Open Meetings Act. That one was approved by the House, but not referred to committee over in the Senate.
And that 2103, that Representative Bowers, we as an organization did have a conversation with her, and that was something that groundwater districts felt like, I think many, that it would be great for the GMAs to have the ability to take advantage of that as well. And so we had worked with her and gotten that added to the bill, but unfortunately it didn't really get very far on the Senate side.
Right.
So that's something hopefully we can continue to think about for those GMAs, particularly ones that span many, many counties, and you're all taking hours out of your day to drive for those meetings. To have the ability to get some of that work done remotely, I think would be good for the process.
Right.
Couple other government open meetings bills. Trent, if you could just speak to a few here that have green after them because they actually passed.
Yeah, these did. So the HB 1154, this one requires certain types of districts to include information about the district on their website, things like the names of the board members, management info, contact info, tax information. I don't believe that one applied to GCDs, but it also, for rural districts, it required them to physically conduct their meetings within 10 miles of their district boundaries or at another place within the county. HB 1560 was the general sunset bill for TDLR, the Department of Licensing and Regulation. It continues the functions of that agency through 2033.
All right, great. So open records was also a conversation that was had, and we did see a handful of bills pass in that regard. Sarah, could you cover some of these for us?
Absolutely. So House Bill 1082 ensures the personal information of elected public officials are exempt from public disclosure. This is something that already existed for state officials. It was just broadened to include any elected officials. So this would be all of your board members, essentially. Senate Bill 1225 requires, it essentially says that you have to continue to respond to public information requests even if you're working remotely. And if a disaster occurs where you're not able to respond to those requests, you can only pause that one time, and then once you start responding again, you can't decide to stop it again and start it again. There's no start and stops, right? And then House Bill 2723, it requires the State Department of Information Resources to establish a website that lists every property tax database maintained by a chief appraiser and some guidance on how a property owner can access the correct database. The reason it matters to groundwater districts is because it has changed the language that you have to post for your property tax hearing by adding references to that database.
And there was one other, we've mentioned this already, but this is a crowd that gets to participate in cybersecurity training, so we want to make sure everybody's up to speed on that. Can you just speak very briefly to 1118?
Yeah, so you guys already know that this has been in place, requirements for cybersecurity training, but it was limited to employees and elected officials with access to a local government computer system or database. What happened this session is a change to expand that to appointed officials, not just elected officials, and it limits the training to those who have access to a database and spend at least 25% of their time on the computer to access them. So that means if you have employees that don't spend more than 25% of their time on a computer, then likely they won't have to be subject to the cybersecurity training like they did before. We had a lot of districts in TWCA that had perhaps maintenance staff that were not spending their time on computer that still had to take cybersecurity training. So this is just better targeting that training.
Thank you for that. All right, so a topic that has come up for the past few sessions and was again a big one this session was the use of public funds for lobbying. Trent, could you speak a little bit to that conversation this session and in particular Senate Bill 10? Yeah,
so the past few sessions we've kind of seen various ideas kicked around to limit public funds and lobbying. Some of them have included outright bans on it, on using any kind of public money for lobbying purposes. This year, that conversation focused more on a transparency focus as opposed to a ban outright. So what this bill would have done is it required any expenditures for lobbying to be voted on at an open meeting as a standalone agenda item. So to kind of just make it more transparent, make it more obvious to the public where those funds are going and what they're being used for. It would have applied to all taxing political subdivisions, subdivisions or districts that issue bonds, publicly owned utilities, river authorities, and water supply corporations.
And are we going to see it again?
We will definitely see it again.
It's already
It did not pass. It hasn't
filed.
been, we've seen it the past probably 3 or 4 sessions already. It'll be back.
Were you saying, Sarah, that it's already been
It's
filed in
yeah,
the
in
special sessions? Mm.
Yeah, it hasn't moved yet, though.
Yeah. Well, and that's a great segue. So now I want to turn the conversation to kind of what's going on now and what we're going to be doing over the interim. CJ, could I start with you and just ask, what's been going on with these special sessions?
Well,
A lot.
not a lot went on in the first special session. The first special session that the governor called on July 8th, very shortly after that began, the vast majority of the House Democrats left the state. And so they weren't able to secure a quorum in the House. And they were gone for the entirety of that first special session, so nothing happened. The governor immediately called a second special session, and special sessions only last 30 days. And unlike regular sessions, the governor sets the agenda for the special session. And so the reason the Democrats left was primarily over an election bill. And that bill got filed again in the second called special session. And again, the Democrats stayed away for about the first 2 weeks of that special session, but enough of them came back on August 19th and restored the quorum, and so the House was able to start meeting again, and bills started moving, and things have actually been moving pretty quickly on the governor's 17 agenda items. This special session ends on September 6th, but as Representative King said yesterday, they think that it'll probably be wrapped up tomorrow. And the elections bill and a number of other bills that the Democrats opposed are passing.
So that leads me to my next question, Sarah. I was going to ask you, have there been any bills filed during these special sessions that might be of interest to the water community, or things that we should be, even though hopefully it ends tomorrow and nothing more gets done, it's still worth, I think, object lesson in what's to come and where the conversations are going?
Yeah. So as CJ mentioned, the governor sets the agenda. He sets the items on the call that the legislature is supposed to take up. And so typically bills that are not on those topics do not pass, but that doesn't mean that they can't. And so we're still tracking them. The Constitution says that you can only pass bills that are related to the topics on the call, but the legislature's really interpreted that very broadly before. And so that sort of allows them to get into a lot more, assuming that the governor doesn't veto it. So the kinds of things that we're watching from the water perspective, 3 topics. First, the taxpayer-funded lobbying that Trent mentioned has been filed. It hasn't moved, though. Second, there's a couple of water infrastructure bills, especially weatherization of critical facilities, and this is sort of related both to the grid, but it also encompasses water facilities, and it would add a very significant program to the Water Development Board, so it's something we're watching closely. That has not moved either. And the third group is related to COVID, and so one of the other bills that impacted did impact GCDs is Senate Bill 968 last session said that you can't impose a vaccine passport. So the bills that have been filed have really been along the lines of strengthening, either adding civil penalties to that or, legislatively codifying the governor's mask mandate. There have been hearings on that bill and another one related to school districts' ability to sort of impose those mask mandates or not, and having some opt-out provisions. They have not advanced to the full House, but that is something that we're watching in case it does impact all government entities.
Thank you for that. So CJ, do you think we'll see an extra special session that's not redistricting?
I think that's possible. I mean, there was some discussion about whether there would be one having to do with something having to do with electricity. If PUC doesn't and ERCOT don't move quickly enough and everything, you may see some action there. You may also, there was some discussion about a special session on the COVID funds and the distribution of those. So they may do that during redistricting, but in redistricting, it'll more than likely be more than one special session, and it'll probably start in a couple of weeks.
That was my next question.
And it's got to be over by, I think it's November 4th or something, so that everything can happen right as far as when primaries are held and everything. So they're going to try to get it done by then.
So the legislatures get to go home for a couple weeks before returning to Austin again.
Maybe, yeah.
Wonderful. Well,
which puts everybody in a really good mood.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and especially for a lot of those representatives who were up in Austin for 6 weeks with nothing to do but couldn't go home, right?
Right.
Yeah. So now I want to turn to the interim. Again, something that Chairman King mentioned, that sort of what you would typically be doing right now is not what's happening. We're not thinking about preparing for the next session, but we're going to get there eventually. And I want to talk a little bit before getting into the specific topics of what we might be talking about in the interim is, what is it going to look like? And CJ, sticking with you for a minute, what do you think these special sessions have done to relationships among legislators? And can they be repaired in the interim before the next session starts?
Relationships are very strained. They're strained between Democrats and Republicans and within the parties themselves, because there's been very different opinions of what to do and how to react and all of that. So it's I don't know that I've ever seen it this strained before. And I'm now I just finished my 19th regular session and my 31st special session. So I don't recall seeing it this strained before. So it probably depends on how difficult redistricting is as to how quickly they can repair.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So during the interim, Sarah, what are some of the things in terms of water that you think we might be focusing on?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to talk about related to the interim on water is that the water agencies are all among the slate of agencies scheduled for sunset review. And the Sunset Advisory Commission is a legislative oversight agency that looks at the continuing need for and makes changes and opportunities to make those agencies work better. So the Water Development Board, TCEQ, PUC, State Soil and Water Conservation Board, among a whole bunch of others, are scheduled for review. So as stakeholders, you all will all be invited to offer comment or feedback if you have that for the agencies. But what that means for us next session is that you've got some very significant and probably the largest water bills that will be moving through those substantive committees will be the sunset bills. And sunset bills generally have to pass in order to continue the agencies, so there's a lot of momentum behind getting those passed. So they end up being targets for amendments for other topics well beyond what the Sunset Commission itself adopts. And so I anticipate that we'll be watching those and we'll be watching for amendments to those, and that some of our own ideas might even be wrapped up into that.
Absolutely. So turning to you, Trent, what topics this interim is your organization focused on?
I think the big one is going to be SB3, getting compliant with it. A lot of our members, SB3 had provisions for various things you can do to comply with it. Some of them very simple, like just belonging to a statewide mutual aid organization, which most of our members do. That said, many of our folks are wanting to go above and beyond that. They don't want to be put in the position of not being able to provide water during an emergency. So what we're seeing is a lot of folks trying to find funding to buy generators or figure out ways to winterize their infrastructure so that pipes don't freeze and things of that nature. So I think that's going to be the big thing, is getting those emergency plans put together finding funding. I know CJ mentioned the federal COVID funds coming to Texas that might be a subject of interim special sessions. That's going to be something that our guys are going to be really trying to find funding in there to help them get ready for being prepared for the next weather emergency like we saw this year.
Yeah, and we actually have a speaker later today who's going to be talking in greater detail about the American Recovery Plan Act funding and what it might mean for water. So we'll definitely dive into that more then. So now let's talk about interim charges relating to groundwater. Starting with you, Sarah, what do you think we might see?
Well, I don't know how dominant groundwater issues are going to be as far as interim charges, but if I had to guess, I would definitely think that we would be talking about the same topics that we've been talking about here this past 45 minutes, is those issues that continue to be there but that haven't quite passed the legislature, continuing to work through those, especially those where we need to have the stakeholders come together a little more. And water data probably is another one that is probably going to continue to be on that list.
CJ?
I completely agree with Sarah that those issues we've discussed will be coming back. I think the whole interaction between groundwater and surface water will also be another big topic of discussion.
Trent?
Don't want to be left out. I think they're right. Nothing's ever really dead. So I think a lot of the stuff that didn't make it across this year, one thing that always seems to be in the mix is kind of the access to groundwater, kind of the push-pull between landowners and other entities, cities, utilities who need the same groundwater. Never surprised to see that in the interim charges.
And that reminds me, Trent, so the Texas Rural Water Association has in the past advocated for some changes to Chapter 36 regarding the consideration of service area. That was not something that was discussed this last session. Is that something that you guys think maybe it warrants a conversation during the interim and next session? I
mean, it always is something that's worthy of conversation. I don't think that we're really looking to push any changes anytime soon. We've kind of gone that way the past couple of sessions and haven't been able to get consensus. So it's probably, something worth talking about, but that's probably where I see it going in the near future.
All right, wonderful. Well, that wraps up what I've got on my outline. I want to leave an opportunity to let the audience ask any questions of our panelists. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask anyone? All right, I do not see any questions from the audience, so I want to thank you all for coming today, for providing your thoughts and your insights. It has been a wild ride this last session, and it doesn't feel like it's over. It's just going to bleed into the next one, I think. So thank you for that. Thanks for coming and being a part of our event.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.